One rainy evening, I unlocked a door that had been sealed for longer than anyone living could remember. The key had been sitting inside an old prayer book for years, and I only found it because the binding had cracked during a flood, and I was the one assigned to repair it. Behind that door was a room filled with centuries of records, and buried beneath all of it was a sealed document bearing signatures I recognized from every portrait hanging in our main hall. I read the first 3 pages standing up in the dark, with rain hitting the stone walls outside, and within minutes I understood two things with complete certainty. If anyone discovered I had read those pages before I decided what to do with them, everything I had given my life to could be taken from me. And if I said nothing, if I simply resealed that document and walked away, thousands of people who had never set foot inside our walls would continue paying a price they never knew had been placed on them. Here is what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. By the end of this story, you will know that the greatest betrayal recorded in those pages was never committed against the convent itself. It was committed against the very people the convent had sworn on its founding day to protect forever. To understand why I chose to reveal the one secret that could destroy my own reputation, I need to take you back to who I was before that rainy evening changed everything. My name is Sister Celestine. I had been a member of the Order of the Immaculate Charter for 23 years. I entered the convent at 20 years old, young and completely certain about what I was doing, and I never once in those 2 decades felt that certainty waver. My work inside the convent was archival. I was responsible for preserving our historical records, restoring damaged manuscripts, cataloging old correspondence, maintaining the integrity of documents that stretched back to the convent's founding over 400 years ago. I loved that work with a quiet and very personal devotion. Every old letter, every faded ledger page, every crumbling church register felt to me like a human life that deserved to be held carefully rather than forgotten. My sisters sometimes called me the keeper, and I accepted that with real gratitude. I also served 2 days each week in our community outreach program, delivering food and medicine to poor families in the villages surrounding our property. That work grounded me. It reminded me constantly of why the convent existed not as a refuge from the world, but as a servant to it. I admired our founders deeply. Everything I had read about them described extraordinary women who had given up safety, comfort, and inheritance to build something that would outlast them. I believed our institution had faithfully carried that legacy forward. I believed that without question, until I found the key. It was late autumn when the river swelled and water seeped beneath the archive room doors. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but several old storage rooms along the lower corridor flooded, and the process of drying, sorting, and restoring what had been damaged took months. That is how I came to be handling a collection of old prayer books that had been stored in crates and largely ignored for decades. Most were standard worn, beautiful in their own quiet way, nothing unusual. Then I found one with a cracked spine, and when I opened it to assess the damage, the key fell out and hit the stone floor with a sound I still hear clearly in my memory. The key was small, iron, old. It had a number etched into its surface. I matched that number to a storage room 3 levels below the main archive, a room I had walked past hundreds of times, a room that was always locked, a room that appeared in no inventory list I had ever seen, and I told myself I was investigating a storage discrepancy. That is what I told myself. What I found inside that room required weeks to begin understanding. Rows of shelving filled with records that should have been part of the main archive but had been deliberately separated. I started cataloging them carefully and quietly, working late in the evenings, telling no one. And almost immediately, I noticed something wrong. The official history of our convent described a long, unbroken tradition of charitable service to poor families, widows, orphaned children, and displaced communities. Every formal document in our main archive supported that description, but down in that sealed room, the original records told a different story. The first inconsistency I found was in the charitable ledgers. Our official records showed continuous charitable distributions across every decade of the convent's history, but the original ledgers from that sealed room showed a very clear pattern: generous, documented, carefully tracked charitable work in the first 130 years. and then a gradual, almost imperceptible decline beginning in a specific decade. Not a sudden stop, nothing dramatic. A slow withdrawal, fewer families listed, smaller distributions, longer gaps between community visits. And then, over the following 2 centuries, the official records had simply continued describing charitable work that, according to the original documents, had quietly become a fraction of what it once was. That troubled me, but I wasn't ready to call it anything yet. I kept searching. The second discovery was harder to explain away. Buried inside a water-damaged correspondence file, I found sealed letters between senior leaders from roughly 200 years ago. They were discussing a legal agreement, a land arrangement that had transferred significant property originally designated for charitable housing into administrative use. The letters were careful in their language, bureaucratic and measured. But one phrase appeared in 2 separate letters, and I read it both times until it fully settled into me. The phrase was, "The mission must adapt to the needs of sustainability." And the context was unmistakable. They were choosing the institution's financial stability over the people the institution had been created to serve. I sat on the floor of that sealed room and I did not move for a long time. Because here is what I had to reckon with. These were not villains. The leaders who wrote those letters were not cruel women. They were frightened ones. They were protecting something they loved from financial collapse. They made a decision that felt practical and temporary, and then that decision became policy, and then policy became tradition, and then tradition became history, and then history became the identity of the institution. Over 200 years, no single person had committed an act of obvious evil. What had happened instead was that each generation had inherited a slightly smaller version of the original promise and accepted it as normal. Comfortable silence had compounded across centuries into a betrayal so complete that no one living even knew it had happened. That was the moment everything inside me shifted. I had started this investigation half expecting to find embezzlement, a hidden scandal, something with a villain and a motive I could point to clearly. Instead, I found something far more heartbreaking, a slow, generational fading of compassion. And I understood, sitting on that cold floor, that this was not a story about corruption in the way I had imagined. This was a story about what happens when good people stop asking whether their institution still deserves the trust placed in it. I spent 6 more weeks documenting everything. I photographed pages, cross-referenced dates, matched names from the sealed correspondence to names in the official records, and traced the original founding charter through 4 generations of amendments until I found the original language, the exact, unambiguous promise made by our founders on the first day this convent existed. That promise was not vague. It named specific communities. It committed to specific protections. It described the convent's resources not as the institution's property, but as resources held in trust for the vulnerable families it served. Those words had been quietly removed from every subsequent version of the charter over the centuries, each revision erasing a little more until nothing remained. I brought my full documentation to our current Mother Superior. That conversation was the hardest thing I have done in my life. I laid every piece of evidence on the table between us, organized and clear, and I watched her read through it in silence. When she looked up, she did not look angry. She looked devastated, and she said something I will carry with me forever. She said, "I always sensed something was missing in what we were, and I was afraid to look for what it was." She called a full council of the senior leadership. I presented the evidence to all of them together. There was resistance. I will not pretend there wasn't. Several senior members argued that the documents were too old to be actionable, that the convent's modern charitable work spoke for itself, that drawing public attention to historical records could permanently damage trust in everything we had built. I understood every one of those concerns. I genuinely did. But I also understood what I had read in those founding letters, women who had sacrificed everything so that no widow, no orphan child, no struggling family would be forgotten. And I knew that protecting our reputation at the expense of that promise would simply be the latest chapter in the same long betrayal. The council ultimately voted to acknowledge the full historical record. That process took months. We worked with historians, legal advisors, and community representatives from the villages our founders had originally served. We issued a formal public acknowledgement of how the charitable mission had diminished across generations, and we established a documented restoration plan, real resources, real commitments, tracked and made publicly accountable. The sealed room was properly integrated into the main archive. Nothing was removed. Everything was preserved, including the letters that were hardest to read, because I believed then, and I believe now, that an institution serious about its values does not hide the moments when it failed them. The families and communities who had been quietly losing support they never knew had been promised to them their needs did not vanish because they hadn't known. Need doesn't require awareness of injustice to be real. We began restoring charitable distributions, housing support, and community medical assistance in those villages. Slowly, carefully, with the humility that acknowledgement demands. And me? I am still here. I still work in the archive. Some mornings I walk past the door of that sealed room and I remember the rain and the key and the cold floor and the moment I realized that the most dangerous betrayal is not the one committed in violence or greed, it is the one committed in silence, across generations, by people who loved something so much they forgot to keep asking whether it still deserved that love. I used to believe that loyalty meant protecting the institution. I know now that real loyalty means protecting the values the institution was built to serve. And if those two things ever come into conflict, there is only one right answer, no matter how much it costs you. True courage is not protecting a reputation. It is having the faithfulness to restore what was always meant to be right. I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it honestly. If you had found those documents, if you had held in your hands the proof that something you had devoted your entire life to had quietly stopped being what it promised to be, would you have spoken? Would you have risked everything? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you would have done. And if this story reminded you that real courage is not about protecting institutions, but about protecting truth, compassion, and the people who were always depending on both, please share it. Because that reminder is one worth passing on.